Let's say God exists, not just any God, but a God that is all loving, all powerful, and desires a personal relationship with humanity. Now ask yourself one question. Why isn't his existence obvious? Why is there still room for doubt? And why are there sincere people who spend years searching for God, yet still remain unconvinced? This is one of the most powerful objections to Christianity, and philosophy calls it divine hiddenness. J.L. Schellenberg claims that if a perfectly loving God truly wanted a relationship with every single person, then anyone who is genuinely trying and is genuinely open to that relationship should be able to find him. Yet, there seems to be loads of people who are open to that and sincerely who seek him, who are still not convinced of his existence. As a result, he argues that if even one of these people exists, then a perfectly loving God who wants a relationship with us doesn't. I personally think this is a pretty strong objection that every serious Christian really needs to try and wrestle with and grapple with. It's pretty undermining if you ask me, and it holds real weight. Think of it like a game of hide and seek between a parent and a child. Now, if a loving parent really loves their child, and for whatever reason the child ends up incessantly crying and desperately tries to find the parent, I don't think the parent would continue hiding. They would try and make as much noise as possible. They would turn on all the lights, they would call out their name, and they would make themselves known and visible, is the point. So why doesn't God? I think looking at it initially, this seems like a pretty coherent argument, but I think personally it rests on an assumption that deserves to be questioned, which is not why does God hide, but rather does God actually hide? Many Christian philosophers would argue that he doesn't. Instead, they suggest that God has made himself reasonably knowable without making himself impossible to reject. Some would point towards the extraordinary order of the universe, arguing that the existence of a life-permitting cosmos is itself evidence of a creator. Others would point towards history, claiming that God did reveal himself 2,000 years ago, but we murdered him for it, suggesting that even if God gave us enough evidence, then we would still reject him nonetheless. And maybe this means that God's form of revealing himself to us is different than what we presently expect. Maybe it's an act of mercy. Now, obviously, whether one accepts those arguments is an entirely different question, but if they are true, then this suggests that the issue might not be the absence of evidence. The issue then may be the fact that God should provide a different kind of evidence that would essentially make disbelief psychologically impossible. And I think that leads to a deeper question. And that is this fair? When people ask for proof of God, what sort of proof are they actually looking for? Holistically speaking, very few things in this life come with absolute certainty. Can you prove that your closest friend actually loves you? Or do you infer it from the countless acts of kindness, sacrifice, and trust? Can you prove that the external world actually exists like you perceive it? Or could this all be a dream? Can you even prove that you're even watching me right now? Or is this the newest update of Claude Code that simulates perfectly my voice and my mannerisms? Obviously, this has been a debate for centuries, but maybe the question isn't whether God has provided mathematical certainty, but whether he's provided sufficient evidence to actually seek him. Some thinkers go even further. They argue that if God was to make his existence as undeniably clear as, let's say, maybe the sun, then our responses would be fundamentally different. And this means that a relationship that's freely entered into is different to one that's entered into under overwhelming compulsion. Whether that's a satisfying answer is obviously something each of us has to decide on our own, but I think ultimately divine hiddenness challenges both us believers and skeptics. Believers must ask themselves whether they take this sort of objection as seriously as they can, and I think skeptics must ask themselves whether the kind of evidence they demand is the kind of evidence that they expect to see in personal relationships. Because that's what it is at the end of the day, a personal relationship with God and humanity. I think personally, to refrain from any preliminary biases when making a decision or critiquing a worldview or a belief system, I would actually reframe the question to, instead of simply being, where is God? Rather, what kind of God do we actually expect to find?